It's the same hustle, it's the same thing, the same tears on everything. Maybe one day we'll see we're one big family, like it's one kettle. It's the same sunshine, it's the same rain, the same struggle just to maintain. Maybe one day we'll see we're one big family, like it's one kettle.
Greetings and welcome to Discussions with Indigenous Education. I'm your host, Tavis Sanders, also known as Red Tail Hawk. I'd like to welcome our co-host, Renee Sanders, also known as Red Silver Fox.
Greetings, everyone.
This series will be entitled The Genocide of the Dark-Skinned Indian. And this will be a series of shows we think is going to be very, very good aspect of not just what's going on in today's world, but also, some of the historical prevalence to, what's happening here in the United States today. A few years ago, we did a video on the genocide of the Black Indian. I don't know if you could recall that.
Yeah, that was a few years ago.
It was a few years ago. And I'm not realizing at the time that an extensive report had been filed at the United Nations on genocide of the Negro people, right? And so we wanted to, once we found out about this genocide report, we started reading into it. We said, wait a second, we really need to do a show about genocide and specifically, the dark-skinned Indian. And
that was because really there were a lot of similarities, of course.
Of course.
That was in that report that we know are things that we need to bring to the surface so people can know.
Okay. Yeah, so let's talk about that report for a second, and then we can share with the audience how these things correlate as we go further.
Okay. All right. Well, the name of the report was called We Charge Genocide, the Crime of Government Against the Negro People. This report, it was, they presented it to the United Nations in 1951, okay, and it was presented in New York by Paul Robeson, and it was presented in Paris at a UN meeting in Paris by a gentleman by the name of William Patterson.
Okay, right, and we always think that it's important for us to know the people that are making history, right? And so let's get a little bit of information on William Patterson, and so that we can understand, the times, what's happening, and some of the things that they were going through.
Okay. Well, William Patterson, of course, was a civil rights advocate. His father was from St. Vincent from the islands, and his mother happened to be a former slave. Okay. Whose father was part of a regiment or something that was fighting in the Civil War. Okay.
So he's an advocate, and he's a freedom fighter. And in his history, they've battled through slavery, emancipation, and these things, definitely had an influence on the direction that he chose to go as a part of his path, and making history, really.
Oh yes. And the other gentleman, Paul Robeson. Some people may recognize that name because right. He was a little bit more famous than William Patterson was. Okay. Okay, but Paul Robeson was an NFL football player. He was a lawyer. He was a stage actor. He was a singer. He was the first black person that was given a starring role in a movie, and he still even holds a Broadway record of the most Shakespearean performances that were performed on Broadway. He still holds that record.
Right. So, and again, somebody that's a history maker, right? As a matter of fact, I'm not sure if you have the quote, but didn't he have a quote about why he was doing what he was doing as far as representation was concerned?
Well, it wasn't him.
Oh, okay.
It was William Patterson.
Okay.
And it was Patterson that when someone complained that they submitted this genocide report to the United Nations. And there were a lot of people that did not appreciate that. Okay. And they accused them of attacking the government, the United States government.
Mm-hmm.
And so William Patterson replied that it's your government, it's my country. I am fighting to save my country's democratic principles.
Okay, right. So again, another freedom fighter and advocate that's, pushing for their rights to be heard. Again, this is the 1950s, right?
Yes.
And so,
you know what? Another thing, though, that is very interesting is that there's another famous name that was along with this, which is W.B. Du Bois.
Okay.
And W.B. Du Bois was supposed to accompany William Patterson in Paris to make this, to report, to submit this report to the United Nations. They revoked his passport. So he was not able to travel to Paris. What's also interesting, though, is that Paul Robeson's passport had previously been revoked, and so that's why he was the one that was designated to submit it in New York.
Okay.
New York,
all right, and so I want us to remember these small facts. Of course, everybody knows W.E.B. Du Bois, right? And if you're not familiar with Paul Robeson, Philadelphia has a Paul Robeson House in West Philly, right? That you can, learn a lot about who this man was and a lot of the history that he holds with respects to, so-called Black America, right? And it's important for us to know our histories, not just a history that we think belongs to us, right? With that said, I know that we just stated that some of these individuals' passports was being restricted and that their voices were being silenced, right? And I want us to remember that as we move forward in these next episode and throughout this series of the genocide of the dark-skinned Indian, because, events and facts that showcase things that harm a group of people, like trying to quiet them, right, and not have them be able to participate in a larger world politics is something that may just fit a genocidal act. With that said, we are talking about the genocide of the dark-skinned Indian, but right now we've been talking about this Charge Genocide Report that was filed by the, quote-unquote, Negro people. And we wanted to highlight and show people maybe just one or two things, right, about how these things connect to each other. And so, why is it?
Yeah, I was going to say, you mind if I read the conclusion that they put in their petition?
Okay.
Because again, I think that these words are important.
Okay, right.
Okay, and again, this is how the petition concluded. It says, the oppressed Negro citizens of the United States, segregated, discriminated against, and long the target of violence, suffer from genocide as the result of the consistent, conscious, unified policies of every branch of government. If the General Assembly acts as the conscience of mankind, and therefore acts favorably on our petition, it will have served the cause of peace.
Mm-hmm. And that's a really, good way to sum it up. Nicely put, right? Politically spoken well, right? The reality is that, a disenfranchisement has happened to a collective group of people. And, let's identify again, right? We're talking about the Black Indian, the dark-skinned Indian, but right now we're talking about the We Charge Genocide charge, which was with respects to the Negroid people. And I would like to just factually build the bridge for individuals so that they could follow us and see why these two things connect. And that's with the Smithsonian Institute's 19th annual report. If I'm not mistaken, it's from 1897 and
1897 to 1898.
Okay. And, we can show the full quote here, but just basically it stated that the blood of the Southern Negro was unquestionably Indian, right? And throughout our presentations, we have documented many factual ways and historical relevance and all kinds of information that you can go back and research and watch in our shows so that you can understand how the idea of a brown-skinned indigenous population that was mixed up, right? And eventually was assimilated into what is now being called the Black population. So we're talking about a specific group that's been lumped into a larger history, and we're showcasing a very unknown and admitted history and highlighting why genocide might actually fit the legal framework of what has happened to us until this day. Yeah. And so we're going to leave it there. And when we get back, we can actually start to learn about genocide, and maybe look at the definitions and maybe some small things before we go.
Okay.
All right. So we'll be right back with more discussions with Indigenous Education, the genocide of the dark-skinned Indian.
Greetings. I'm Red Silver Fox, co-founder of Indeed Indigenous Education, and I would like to invite you to visit indedushop.com. That's indedushop.com, and help support our mission to educate the public of the omitted history of the brown and dark-skinned indigenous population of the Americas. And, as always, we would like to thank you for your support.
You're watching Discussions with Indigenous Education.
Welcome back to Discussions with Indigenous Education, the genocide of the dark-skinned Indian. Right before the break, we were just talking about the We Charge Genocide Report and the filing that was presented by, certain individuals back in the 1950s charging the United States with genocide, and the reality is that these individuals were quieted. Their passports were taken from them. Their travel was limited, right? They had FBI files against them, right?
And in future shows, we're going to find out that those are things that were utilized that are tools of genocide.
Right, and so it's important for us to remember this as as we go through this. We also, talked about, specific facts like our Smithsonian Institute's 19th annual report, right, page 233 for those individuals that would like to reference this information, right? And so let's actually start getting into the meat of this, right? They have a little bit of backdrop about, the dark skin issue in the United States as a whole. But let's talk about genocide for a minute. And I guess the first thing we could do is actually, talk about genocide, where it came from, the definition of it. And so where do we begin?
Okay. Well, what is very interesting is that, and I know most people don't realize, is that genocide was a new word that was just coming up around World War II. It was first coined in a book in 1944, yes, by the name of a gentleman by the name of Raphael Lemkin. He wrote a book that was called The Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, and he was addressing the atrocities that were happening to the Jewish people during World War II. And so, again, this was a new terminology that was just first seen in this book in 1944. What it is actually...
Well, before we get into what it is,
okay,
let's talk about Lemkin for a second.
Okay.
Because again, I feel like the individuals are important, right? And why these things are happening at the times that they are happening, and what influenced these individuals to take these steps. Again, these people have made history, right? And so, Lemkin was born in Poland in 1901, right? And he actually was also into law, right? He helped draft the Poland's criminal code after World War I. So as a young man, he's helped draft the criminal code. And then he actually gets caught up in fighting against the Nazis when they invaded, right? And so as a part of his, as a part of being at war, he actually gets lost in the woods by himself for months before he gets picked up, and then he comes through Sweden and he comes to the United States, and he gets here to the United States, and then that's when he begins this push to have genocide be recognized as a crime. So he's informing, he's writing, he's talking to all of the political elites here in the United States.
And this is still during World War II.
And this is still during World War II. And, you know, from what I could tell, he actually had a large part to play in the development, or at least the United States' part in the development of the United Nations, and why the United Nations really came about, which was, you know, to stop genocidal practices and to bring about a more peaceful and harmonious world, so-called. And so, you know, again, a very important player in history. And I just wanted to, you know, show him a little bit of dignity and respect for what he has tried to offer to the world community.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and so, you know, recognizing, you know, who this man is, let's talk about genocide.
The word itself.
Yes,
okay.
The word itself.
Yes. Well, the word is actually a combination of two foreign languages, Greek and Latin. The genos comes from Greek, and it means family or clan, all right? And the side part is from Latin, which just means killing.
Okay.
So the definition itself from Britannica, I have that it is the deliberate and systematic destruction of a group of people because of their ethnicity, nationality, religion, or race. Another definition, which is still basically the same thing, this is from Merriam-Webster, and this is the deliberate and systematic destruction of a racial, political, or cultural group.
Okay, right, and so that's the definition, right? And base, you know, that's the basic definition. You can find that everywhere, right? And so let's talk about it for a moment before we take our next break, right? And so, you know, genocide, I'm going to look at it, but it was first recognized as it was first filed as a crime in 1946, right? This is when they're trying to organize it under international law, right? But it's not going into effect yet. This is just when the United Nations is saying, hey, listen, this is the issue. We want this crime to be identified as a crime and recognized by the international community as a law. Do not commit genocide, right?
And it was the first treaty it was the first human rights treaty.
Okay.
That was a global treaty. You know, for civil rights themselves. That's the first one.
And so that you can reference it if you want to look at it and read it as a part of your, you know, reference information as you know, doing your homework on this show. The actual name of the law is called the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And again, most of the time it's just called the Genocide Convention. But let me read that one more time because it matters, right? The Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. And so it's not, you know, it's two-faceted. That when people say, okay, you know, people can commit genocide, well, you know, what happens next? There is actually a legal method to resolve the matter if genocide has taken place. And, you know, unfortunately, I don't think that this world pays attention to that aspect of the law. But, you know, as far as the law itself was concerned, internationally, it was supposed to be considered as one of the first and very, very crucial steps in developing and setting the foundation for all human rights, right? Not only that it was the first human rights document, but it's the foundation for all of the so-called human rights documents that's been passed since, right? And so, you know, that's important. And, you know, as you stated before, it was actually the first thing passed by the General Assembly back in 1948, you know. And so all of these things are very important, but let's talk about the time, right? You know, it's not, we're talking about 1948 is when it was the General Assembly had adopted it. However, it didn't become into law, right?
Well, you know, even before that, we have to realize that up until 1945, there wasn't even a United Nations.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Exactly. And so, we could talk about those things when we get back from break. Okay.
Okay. All right.
All right. So we'll be right back with more discussions with Indigenous Education, the genocide of the dark-skinned Indian.
An American Deceptions Revealing America's Dark-Skinned Past, Volume 1, is a trailblazing depiction of the lesser-known history of America's dark-skinned indigenous peoples, now referred to as African American and Afro-Latinos. Red Silver Fox Thunderbird mends together indigenous oral history, primary sources, archaeology, and extensive research to paint a vivid picture of the original groups that resided in the Americas in the shadows of the continent's past, which include both Mongoloid and Negroid groups. Revealing America's Dark-Skinned Past exposes the true history of indigenous Americans in contrast to what we have been told in school and what has been presented in entertainment. This miseducation and reclassification of the original peoples span over hundreds of years, but Thunderbird impressively lays out how identity transformation occurred. This book reveals hidden knowledge that shatters the accepted concept of the transatlantic slave trade and makes one question the African identity given to Black Americans and Afro-Latinos. Revealing America's Dark-Skinned Past, Volume 1, is a noteworthy book that confronts an element of American Indian and Black history that many have not grasped.
You're watching Discussions with Indigenous Education.
Greetings and welcome back to Discussions with Indigenous Education, the genocide of the dark-skinned Indian. Before the break, we were talking about the United Nations, and the reality is that, a lot of these things are happening, as the United Nations is actually organizing itself, right? The Genocide Convention itself is the first thing that the United Nations does. So, let's get a little bit about a backdrop in the story so that we can have some historical context around some of these events and decisions that are being made.
Okay, well, as World War II was ending, okay, 50 countries met in California, in San Francisco. They met from April to June in 1945, okay? And what they were doing is that they were formulating the concept of the United Nations.
Okay.
So they met all the way from April to June, and then in June, all 50 countries signed an agreement in June 45 to become the United Nations, and then it went into full effect on October 24, 1945.
All right, so this is like right at the end of World War II.
Yes.
Yes. And so, and again, genocide was a matter of interest at that time. If anybody knows about, the history of the world, during that time, right? Unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of the things being repeated in today's time, but that's a conversation for one of the other shows, right?
Yes.
And so it's 1945. The United Nations has come into effect, right? It's initially 50 countries, right?
Yes.
And so again, the first thing that they do is, as a collective group, they ratify the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Excuse me for that. I want to make sure I got it right? But it doesn't necessarily go into full effect, right? They begin this process in 1948, and then it becomes into effect, a few years later. Let's talk about that process.
Okay, well, we really don't have enough time to go into all of that detail about all the finalities of the convention and everything. But as of today, there are 153 countries that have signed on to the convention.
All right. Okay. And we also know that the convention is legally binding in today's world. And so even if you haven't signed on, you are still held liable against committing the crime. And that's a conversation for us, again, to go over in some of the next shows that we have on the topic. And so, again, we run out of time this one, so let's wrap it up. Let's share a little bit of the things that they learned today, and, then we can talk about what we'll be discussing next show, right? Mm-hmm. And so, again, in this show, we know that, genocide was codified in the mid 40s, right? In the early 50s, it became law, an international law, right? It came out of a book called The Axis of Evil. And
the Axis rule in occupied Europe.
Okay, Axis of Evil. That's enough for me, right?
It's time to wrap up.
Yeah. And so if they're interested in reading that book, they can go take a look at that book. It also, came about after World War II, right? And was one of the first documents that was agreed upon at the United Nations itself, right?
And people realizing really that genocide is a fairly new terminology.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right, and we also know that there was a petition that was filed right after genocide became law, right? Called the We Charge Genocide Report, the crimes against the United States, right? The crime of the United States against the Negro people, right? And so definitely if you're interested in reading that, a lot of history, a lot of really important facts about the plight of darker skinned people here in the United States, whether you were diasporic here or whether you are indigenous to here. And so really important things. As we move forward, we'll start to get into the definition a little bit more, and we'll actually get into the articles in the next show. So we hope you stay tuned. We hope you learned something new today. I'm your host, Tavis Sanders, also known as Red Tail Hawk. We'd like to thank our co-host, our co-founder, and my mama, right? Red Silver Fox, also known as Renee Sanders. And we hope to see you next time on Discussions with Indigenous Education, the Genocide of the Dark-Skinned Indian. Peace.
Peace.
It's the same hustle, it's the same thing, the same tears on that we fade. Maybe one day we'll see we're one big family, like it's one.